Hello and welcome to this very special series on the future of mobility right here on Moneycontrol. I'm Karunya Rao, and today we will be talking about personal mobility with a focus on policy, the government's perspective, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and an enabling environment. And to join me in this conversation, may I welcome on board Mr. Jyoti Malhotra, the MD of Volvo Cars India, Mahua Acharya, she's the MD and CEO of Convergence Energy Services, and Sumit Mittal, he's the CFO at Green Cell Mobility. Thank you so much for taking time out and joining us today. Jyoti, my first question will be to you. The government has framed a policy wherein it plans to allow petrol pumps to set up EV charging stations. Now, talk to us about how will this help increase the number of charging points across the country, and how essentially is this whole integration likely to pan out?
Yeah, in my view, I think it is a good idea in the sense that, see, we have already other infrastructure available. These are the places where customers are used to visit and sort of go and get their cars filled up with the petrol or diesel today. Later on, I think these can get converted into, as we move more towards electrification of all the vehicles, these places can be very easily used. The only challenge I foresee is that maybe in the urban areas and in where I think availability of, let's say, high kilowatt wattage is not a challenge. But I think going up country in those places, if we are able to provide a high kilowatt power, I think it's a fantastic idea, and I think this can really bring a big difference. And consumers will not see the difference between going and getting fuel filled up, whether it's a petrol or a diesel, or tomorrow it could be electric. If the high fast charging, high kilowatt chargers are made available, and that would solve this problem in a great way. So I believe it's a very good idea.
Nova, do you agree? Your company name is also Convergence. Is it a good idea to converge the various energy resources together and perhaps, in the form of a petrol pump in this case?
Firstly, thank you for having me at this panel. Absolutely agree. Let me be a little bit more specific and accurate. The government is doing a huge amount on building up the electric mobility ecosystem. And since you were asking about charging stations, let me be really clear. The need for charging stations is less of an issue when it comes to two-wheelers and three-wheelers. And why I say issue, because you don't have as many of the obstacles that you have for putting up bigger charging stations for four-wheelers and so on. As far as buses are concerned, we deal with them in depots and we deal with them en route. So the government is doing, I mean, there are many pockets in the government that are simultaneously working on charging infrastructure. How do we make them green? In fact, there is in fact a movement towards using green energy and just making sure that the entire transportation system is as green as we can make it. So we're getting there. There are some policy liberalizations that are happening, that people have been working on. There are, of course, I mean, things are not done. Bear in mind that it doesn't, in this country, in any country as big as ours, it takes a while to get large scale things like this done. So what happens in Delhi takes some time before it's in fact implemented out in the states. So that's where we are, and so different states are in different stages of their of development.
Talking about development, there's been a pilot project that is being planned to install electric highway system between the Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, which can be electrified using solar power. At the same time, you also have NHAI that's looking to install at least 700 EV charging stations across the major highways of the country by 2023. Jyoti, my question is this going to be the right shot in the arm that the industry needs right now?
I think, as Mahua said, I think there is a lot that is being done, and all these ideas. I think it's very difficult to see them in piecemeal. I think there are so many things happening. If you go through, government has issued a handbook of creating a charging ecosystem, and all these things will come together and solve this problem. But I think especially when we talk about green mobility, one of the key things that we need to address is that I think for sure we need to have more and more charging stations available. But I think the challenge going forward is going to be how are we going to source them through renewable energy and not through a fossil fuel fed sort of energy. So I think while these sort of on the highways, the 700 odd and more charging stations will come, if these can also be connected in some way through, let's say, solar power fed, even in the let's say in the petrol stations where charging setup is being done, if we can parallelly also focus on sort of feeding them with renewable energies, I think especially solar being available in abundance in our country. I think again, as I said, I think these all things come together. There is a lot which is being done, and these things will finally come together in creating the right infrastructure available, ecosystem available for the consumers, which will ultimately help us move towards better and green and electric mobility.
Sumit, what more can be done to give the industry a booster shot?
Thanks, Karuna, for having me here. Uh, First, I would like to say that the charging infrastructure, the viability of any charging infrastructure is dependent on the uh, density of the vehicles available, right? So if there are, let's say, 100 vehicles available, then the charging infrastructure of 20 or let's say 10 charging infra points is viable, right? So the viability of any charging infrastructure is dependent on the density of the electric vehicles that are present. So it's a catch 22 position that first you get the charging infrastructure or first you get the vehicles on the ground, and without either of them, there is always be a range anxiety and other things which are there. So I think what is very critical to understand is that in the current context, right, where a lot of these great reforms by the government, including moving to green energy and other things, are in process, as told by Mawa and Jyoti. But what we need to understand in the current context, to put minimal load on the existing grid, right? We need to come up with solutions which will offset the peak charging times from the daytime to maybe a night time, where like it's not the peak charging time. So maybe uh, allowing chargings in the parking lots of housing societies, which is Supreme Court has already given an order for that, right, is a step in the right direction. Allowing charging infrastructure points in parking of corporate offices, in malls, in various other places where the cars get parked, they are the that could be a possible immediate access point for creating a charging station density. The challenge that we face in the traditional the charging stations, which are like the petrol pumps and other things where we are trying to put charging stations now, is that the space available in especially the metros is very limited. So we can't expect a 30-40 minutes kind of a charging station, and the technology for having a 5 minute 10 minutes charging, which is extremely fast charging, is not there in most of the vehicles which are there in the which are available now. So that's where the challenge is to kind of augment the charging capability of the ecosystem.
Sumit, you've raised a very interesting point about EV charging station in residential areas and even malls, etc. As we all know, many state governments have offered property tax concessions to housing societies for setting up these charging stations. How has that helped in terms of adoption?
I think changes have started happening. Most of the societies, housing societies, have started approving these changes, because the challenge has been that most of these societies, when they were formed, electric charging was never a thought in the original infrastructure or architecture, right? So one thing that I have observed when I was speaking to some of my friends in real estate is that the current design of most of the buildings which are kind of made are having this as a part of their existing feature list, right? So which is a step in positive direction. Second is a lot of societies are revisiting their architecture to see how can they include this as a part of their infrastructure requirement, right? And it can get upgraded. But yes, there are some resistance, but once the density of purchase, right, goes up. See, India is a very price sensitive market, right? No matter whatever we try to say, unless and until the personal vehicle reaches a 5 lakh per car mark, right? till then, there will be adoption, but it'll be gradual adoption. The moment it touches that mark, right, that's when there will be a tsunami of kind of adoption, and that's when the infrastructure will fall in place, the policy guidelines will fall in place, everything will fall in. The commercial have to first fall in place, and then rest of the things will follow, is what my firm belief is.
Mawa, would you like to add anything to that?
The government is already doing a lot. It's in different pockets. For example, there are open access regulations that are allowing entrepreneurs and industry to come up and set up green supply for charging. So there's a lot being done in different pockets, each of which is addressing a different sort of need. What else can one do? It will take some time. To go back to what Sumit said, charging stations as a business in and of itself is not profitable right now. We don't have the kind of traffic to go through it. And so there's a lot of movement that's in this space right now that's addressing things like tariff, infrastructure, land, business models, money, cars, battery sizes, size of charger. I mean, there's a huge list. So what else can the government do? I think the government is listening, which is quite important. There are many segments in the government that are working on it and are willing to make changes, and that's, I think, quite important. And for as long as we can maintain the dialogue with OEMs, we can maintain a dialogue with financiers and others, I think we will eventually get there. So, let's be aware that there is in fact movement. It's a bit early to suddenly say that charging stations by now should be omnipresent. The fact that we have so many touch points in the system and in the market that have to make approvals, that have to issue orders, takes a bit of time. So yes, charging stations must be omnipresent, but that will only happen when it's a commercial activity.
Let's also get in the OEM perspective with Jyoti present here. Jyoti, tell us, is the industry happy with the kind of aid and incentivization that the government is giving?
Home charging is coming. Anybody, and we see, I think every month the number of EVs being, I'm especially talking about cars being purchased, are increasing at a rapid pace, and that is still limited only by supplies and not, I would say, by demand to a great extent. So customers are coming forward and I think putting their own home charging, and that will happen. The public charging cannot be omnipresent. It will grow as the adoption grows. So it has to only support. So if we are able to provide the car at a right price point with a high charging, I would say, sort of a range which is available, with a home charging solution supported by a reasonable public infrastructure to start with, I think that will help adoption. And then I think from the government side, all the supports that are being announced, whether in form of any tax support or in any which ways, whether it is about fame or whatever, they should continue. Together with this, I think we are on a path where I think customers are coming now closer than maybe 2 years back. Customers were thinking more in terms of curiosity about EVs. Now people are coming forward and buying. And we see this sort of growing month after month. And I think all these things come together can surely help us, I think, move in the right direction. That's my thoughts.
Sumit, what measures do the government and the industry have to take to make sure that EV charging stations get their electricity from renewable sources?
As Mo was suggesting, that a lot of states have already given statewide policies. So they're out of in India we have 20 states which have come up with their state policies, right, which are pro EV policies, which have allowed various benefits, including free wheeling and the cost involved in injection and taking the electricity out from the grid. These are the 2-3 main costs which are involved when you talk about banking of electricity, right? So they have kind of reduced that quite a bit, right? And this will have a positive rub-off in terms of adoption of electric charging solution. The challenge with that could be that the critical mass which is required for such a charging solution has to be a little bit between 2 to 5 kilowatt kind of megawatt kind of a requirement, right? So that is why it's more prevalent in commercial scenario or maybe public charging scenarios, right? But I think states, if they allow freewheeling. They allow the cost involved to bank the electricity to come down. I think that will kind of really catalyst the entire process and kind of fast track the adoption of green energy.
Jyoti, coming to you for some more trend spotting in the electric vehicle space. E-commerce companies are driving the EV boom in a big way by switching to it in their logistics feed. How is that helping with the whole idea of adoption, and how is that helping the sector overall?
See, in my view, when it comes to mobility, whether it is mobility of goods or mobility of people, I think we are very at a very fast pace. I think the adoption has started to take up. I think we are at a point where at a point where I think it will take off from now. We have seen the sort of interest consumers have, let's say, on buying electric two-wheelers. It's already, I think, talk of the town, and a lot of, I think we have seen some manufacturers coming in with a sort of interest and bookings that were given in a day, is something which sort of tells that customers are more than ready to come forward and buy, whether it is two-wheelers, whether they are small commercial vehicles, whether there are, I think, cars. And we are seeing this day by day. Every day is better than the previous day, and as we move forward, we will see that I think more adoption will happen.
Sumit, apart from cost, there's also the issue of time and range, which comes up quite often when we talk about EV adoption. Tell us about the need for the industry to address the issue of the time that is required to charge these batteries, especially for CVs. What's your sense there?
For a commercial purpose, right? Green cell mobility per se focuses on the mass mobility and buses segment, right? So the solution is always custom made for a particular solution, and we have charging solutions at the depot at the midpoints, which kind of tailor mates. We have a charging solution from 20 minutes to an hour to depending on what is the time available. The charging solutions are there, right? I don't think so that charging time is something which is of a constraint, right? It is just on how do you plan the charging. That is, I think, of critical importance, right? So, for example, the time required to charge maybe a vehicle could be 2-3 hours, but that's the time that can be always done at a place where the car is getting parked or the car is getting kind of maybe like at the residence, right? Or maybe at the parking lot. Not necessarily at the uh, the charging point, like a petrol counterpart points, right? So those could be an emergency or a temporary top up solutions, but the primary charging points should be pre-identified at the time of purchase, and should be crystallized at the time of purchase of the vehicle, and the infrastructure should be created.
Mawa, another key concern that often crops up when we talk about EV adoption is the issue of eco-friendly disposal of the end-of-the-life batteries. How can the industry and government work out a policy to handle that?
Thank you for raising that. That is, in fact, the next topic that we have to address as a nation. There have been some efforts by private companies that have stepped forward and got into arrangements around repurposing of batteries. But let's be clear, we don't have critical mass. If we were to expect a private company to get up and set up a repurposing facility, we don't have enough old batteries that can be repurposed. And as I say this, the assumption, of course, is that once the battery has done its time inside a vehicle, it has done its useful life in a transportation system, it doesn't mean it's ready to be discarded and taken into a landfill or anywhere. There is still life in it, provided you repurpose it, and there is a lot of use of that same battery in our energy system. We can use it in rural electrification. We can use it for other sorts of network services. So technically speaking, there is a use for it. That's the next big topic that we should start to think about. But for the most part, I think all of us have been quite consumed in figuring out how to get the wheels on the road and how to get the charging stations up and running. That's the current mass push. And the first lot of, in fact, old, quote unquote, old/used batteries that will come into the system will likely be from buses. And they may, of course, be from others, but the biggest chunk will be coming out of buses, and these are fairly sizable batteries. So we should think about this problem. People are beginning to talk about it. The government is taking note, but for the most part, the focus right now is to figure out how to get the wheels on the road.
Sumit, any closing comments from your end?
We saw it in case of vaccination for the COVID, right? Once there is a, there was an enablement of private parties getting involved in that, right? The uh, the vaccination also took a positive step, right? Same way, I think government has opened all doors for all the private parties to come in by way of PPP, by way of all enabling provisions. Now we are just waiting for the unit economics to fall in place. Once the unit economics is there, I think uh, charging infrastructure should not be a constraint for the EV growth. And I'm sure that we are moving in the right direction. Um uh, uh, there's a lot of support which is coming from the government by the way of PLI schemes, by the way of incentives, by the way of the states agreeing on various exemptions on the EV, and I think by which these targets can be very easily achieved.
On that note, thank you so much, Jyoti, Sumit, and Mawa, for joining in and sharing your insights on the future of mobility in India. It was a pleasure having you on board with us on Money Control.